So it's a privilege for me, first of all, to be with all of you. It's always a simcha for me to share a podium and just to see my friend Rabbi Fold. We have so much in common. We do so much together. And I wish you many, many more wonderful years of good health. Keep up your holy work. It's a privilege for me to share any project with my dear and recent friends, not many years, Rabbi Krupke, Dr. Kalish, and my precious Talmud, Rabbi Sprung, heading the Beis Medrash together with Rabbi Fold. So the issues we came to discuss today are Devorim ha'omdim birumo shel olam. My audience today are medical doctors and medical students. Recently, a person approached me in the street. Is it true that I paskin that if you're not learning Torah all day, you should be a doctor? I laughed and I said, no, that's not a psak. As a psak, it would be a ridiculous psak. But I do agree to say, if you're not teaching Torah, the second best job you could ever have is being a doctor. Because Rabbonim and doctors serve. Life is a mission, we're here to serve. So Rabbonim tend to the nefesh, to the neshama, to the spirit. Doctors are here to preserve life. And we share a mission, serving Klal Yisrael. So it's a covenant and a privilege to address such a big crowd of doctors, present and future. So we're dealing with the greatest mitzvah in the Torah, which is pikuach nefesh. And as Rabbi Full said in his introduction, what chesed means, what atzolas nefashos means, one would assume that pikuach nefesh reigns supreme, and in all circumstances, we need to prolong and preserve life. As a general statement, that is true, but in the details, not always. And sometimes a patient, or even the family of a patient, do have the privilege to choose. So in modern ethics, patient autonomy is huge. And the patient has the right to decide to be or not to be, to live or to die. That is unacceptable by halacha. Chazal say, Bal kochacha atu chai. We cannot choose to live or to die. Our life doesn't belong to us to forego or forfeit. No, Kodesh Baruch Hu gave life. He is the only one to take life. It is only a Kodesh Baruch Hu that gives life that has the right to take life. And in halachic perspective, suicide equals murder. There's no difference between taking your own life and taking the life of another. However, and despite what I just said, there are circumstances in which a person does have the right to choose. And in modern medicine in our time, more than ever before, these questions come up all the time. With the advance of medicine and technology, we have far more means and tools at our disposal than we ever had before to prolong life. And therefore, we are confronted with painful choices and painful questions. When people are extremely of old age, suffering, in pain, terminally ill, the chronically ill? Do we always need to preserve and prolong life? We find a definition in Chazal, chaye sho. That means life, literally translated, loosely translated, it is life that is limited. Life is always limited. No one is here forever. But we do find a concept, chaye sho, twice in Shas. Yom Pe'eh Yom Adalef. The Gemara says, we are to violate Shabbos, even for chaye sho. Rashi writes, chaye sho yoim o yomayim. Person is terminally ill. We know he's approaching the end of the line. He might have a day, he might have 2 days. Would we still violate Shabbos to prolong his life? And the Gemara says, yes. Interesting Meiri. The Meiri says, because in one moment, a person could salvage a lifetime. He could do tshuva. Does this Meiri have any practical halachic implication? And what if he's not from? Very unlikely he'll do tshuva. What is if he is barely conscious or unconscious? He doesn't have the mind to do tshuva. No. The Meiri doesn't really have practical halachic implications. I think the Meiri just means to stress the sanctity and importance of a moment. A moment of life is a world. And it is not us to differentiate between one life and another. So on one hand, the Gemara clearly says, Mechalel and Shabbos b'shvel chaye sho. But there's another sugya in Avodah Zorah Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis, which is a bit complicated, and I'll try to share it with you as best as I can. So in Avodah Zorah Chav Zayin, the Gemara says you cannot go to a non-Jewish doctor because they might murder you and take your life. To us, growing up in a Western world, it seems to be very strange. But knowing the world of yore, I don't think it was strange at all. And 1,000 years ago in Europe and in other places in the world, when anti-Semitism was so rampant and so horrific, yes, in the days of Chazal, it was very common that if a Jew turned to a non-Jewish doctor, he might be putting his life in immediate and imminent jeopardy. So Chazal say you cannot be treated by a non-Jewish doctor without Jewish supervision. However, if a person's life is in immediate danger and all he has is chaye sho, he is permitted to take a chance and be treated by a non-Jewish doctor without supervision. And the Gemara asks why. And the Gemara's response is, L'chaye sho loy chayshina. If he's not going to be treated, he's going to die. And therefore, he is entitled, not only entitled, but obliged to put his life in immediate danger in order to try to achieve a cure. Because sheval taisa means he's going to die in a short while. So the Gemara says, L'chaye sho lo chayshina. How does that fit in with the Gemara where Mechalel Shabbos, even for a day or two? Taisus deals with this question in Masechet Avodah Zorah. And Taisus says, yes. Chaye sho is important enough to override Shabbos. But when we need to weigh the balance, achieving a cure to have a normal lifespan against putting chaye sho in jeopardy, chaye olam would override chaye sho. I think chaye olam is a ridiculous definition. Besides a Kodesh Baruch Hu, no one lives forever. But we mean a normal life expectancy, depending on your age, depending on many other factors. But what is clear from Tosfos is, when we try to achieve a cure to an illness that puts our life in jeopardy, we are entitled to jeopardize Chaye Shah. And this Tosfos is the basis of a radical psak going back more than 300 years. Shalos Teshuvos Shvus Yaakov, Chelek Gimel Siman Ayin Hey. And it's amazing. I don't even understand. I can't even imagine what the practical question was, because surgery was not really very developed in those days, going back almost 350 years. But this Shvus Yaakov deals with the question of a chayla whose life was in jeopardy. And the doctor said, all he has is days or weeks. But they did suggest a new treatment. He might achieve a cure, but it might bring about his immediate demise. What is he supposed to do according to Allah? He can live another few weeks by doing nothing. But according to the doctors, he doesn't have more than another few weeks. Should he choose treatment that might bring about his immediate demise, but he might achieve a cure? The Shvus Yaakov paskins with trepidation. And he says, you need to ask 3 doctors, and you need to ask a Beis Din. But at the end of the day, his psak is, it is the choice of the patient. And he has the right to choose kum v'aseh or shev ba'al das. Yes, he has autonomy. He could say, I want to be passive and let a Kodesh Baruch Hu decide to take my neshama whenever my time comes. But he also has the right to choose treatment, knowing that he might die immediately. That was a novel psak going back more than 300 years, agreed upon by many gedolim of later generations. Binyan Sion, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, was the greatest posek in Germany, going back 150 years. Chelek Aleph Kuf Yud Aleph, Avnei Tzedek in Transylvania, in Romania, Hungary. The Siget Rav was the founder of a Hasidic dynasty, the grandfather of both the Satmar Rebbe and the kaiser Rebbe. Avnei Tzedek Chosh Mishpat Kuf Yutes. Gillian Marsho Yordei Kuv Nun Vav, Reb Shlomo Eger, the great son of Rabbi Kiva Eger. And in later generations, Reb Chaim Oizer, pre-Holocaust Godel of Lithuania, Achiezi Yordei Tesvov, all agreeing to the Shvus Yaakov. Yes, sometimes the patient has autonomy and he has the right to choose. Does he want to put his life in jeopardy and immediacy, trying to achieve a cure, or just leave it up to a Kodesh Baruch Hu? If all I have is Chai Shah, let it be. And then the question would come up, how do we define Chai Shah? As I said before, no one lives forever. Rashi writes, Yomo Yomayim. Does Rashi mean only Yom or Yomayim? The Achiezer, Reb Chaim Isaac Grodzinsky, was one of the greatest poskim and leaders, an amazing Torah personality in pre-Holocaust times. The Achiezer writes, not necessarily Yom or Yomayim, up to 6 months. Why 6 months? That seems to be a guess. Reb Shlomo Kluger, Yoredei Kuf Nun Vav, writes, maybe 12 months. Why 12? In Hilchas Treifus, Chazal teach us a treifa lives up to 12 months. So 12 months is somewhat of a substantial limit. Reb Moshe, probably the greatest posek of our times, Chosh Mishpat Chelek Beis Siman Ayin Hey, has 3 substantial tshuvas, Ayin Gimel, Ayin Daled, Ayin Hey, agrees with Reb Shlomo Kluger, maybe 12 months. The kaiser writes 6 months. Interesting. In the state of Israel, we have a law passed by the Knesset. Chok hanotel amut. The one that initiated and formulated and wrote this law is my dear friend, Professor Steinberg, who probably many of you know. And according to the law, yes, choter hanotel amut has certain privileges and choices for 6 months, and that is based on modern medical statistics and research. Doctors have a fairly accurate ability to predict life expectancy up to 6 months. But whenever they try to go beyond that, the numbers drop dramatically. So it is as if a spark of Ruach HaKodesh in the writings of the Achiezer. It is difficult to define Chayesha. Some Gedolim write, doesn't depend on time. They use a definition in Lashon Kodesh, misnavein v'hoilech, which means his illness is progressive and ultimately would bring about his demise. I cannot agree with that definition because today we are familiar with many progressive diseases. They are progressive, no way back, they're relentless, but sometimes a person could live for many years. So I do not think misnaven v'hoilech would be the proper definition. Very difficult to define, but I think 6 months would be a fair assumption. And this brings us to another halachic debate. So based on the opinion of the Sus Yankov, which is almost unanimously agreed upon, and I quoted many Gedolim following in his footsteps, does it depend on the statistics? What are the chances to achieve a cure? Mishnas Chachamim says, only if statistically it's more than 50% that he would achieve a cure. The Achiezer once again disagrees, and he says, even if it is less than 50%, the patient has the right to dream, to hope, to try to achieve a cure, even though he's putting his life in immediate jeopardy. In my tshuvas, Shalos tshuvas Minchaso Shechelek Aleph Kuf Yudalet Kuf Tezvav, I side with the Achiezer. So this is one area in which we do, halacha does agree to patient autonomy. Is a patient entitled to forego treatment that is stressful, that is painful? Just a week ago, I had a phone call which made me cry. 15-year-old girl calls me. Her friend was standing right next to her with a terrible case of cancer. And she's in chemotherapy and she is in so much pain. And she asked me, could I stop treatment? I no longer have koyach to bear this. The doctors say, without chemotherapy, she probably will die within 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Chemotherapy won't give her a cure, but she might have some months. I asked that girl, what do your parents feel? And she said, my parents said I should ask that of. Whatever that of says, I shall do. I cried and I told that girl, if you don't have the koyach to take it, you don't need to continue chemotherapy. And you have the right to say, Rabbeinu Shalom, I'm yours, my neshama is yours. And if you want to take me home, it's up to you. I apologize for becoming emotional, but I'm choking right now when I just remember that phone call. And this is a psak I gave many times, but not many times to a 15-year-old girl. 15-year-old girls should be playing with their friends, not dying in a cancer ward. But those are the ways of a Kodesh Baruch Hu. And we never question his judgment. So is a patient entitled to forego treatment, or is he always mechuyev to try to prolong his own life? The Magen Avraham, Shin Chav Ches Yud Kotten Vav, Tshuvas Radbaz Chelik Gimel Tov Mem Daled. They say a person has no right not to go for treatment, but they deal with a totally different question that has nothing to do with our discussions. They're dealing with a Chodesh Yesh V'Sakana that either needs to eat Yom Kippur, or he needs to be Machal Shabbos, or he needs to eat treif food. And he wants to be frum. And he says, I am willing to jeopardize my life, and I don't want to be Machal Shabbos or eat non-kosher food. Magen Avraham says, that is a sin. His mitzvah is to preserve his life. And when we say Pekuach Nefesh Doicha Shabbos, it is not only permissible, but it is mandatory. That's a chiyuv. So it has nothing to do with our discussion. Rabbi Yankov Emden in Moir Uktzio, Sefer Shechanoch Orachaim, Shin Chof Ches, says, if a patient doesn't believe in the efficiency and the effectiveness of a certain treatment, we would not impose the treatment on him. And he has the right to say, I don't believe in this treatment, and I'm not going for it. That Rabbi Yankov Emden is no longer relevant. Rabbi Yankov Emden's psak is based on an assumption, excuse me for using such simple language, on the assumption that doctors don't really know what they're talking about. That is Rabbi Yankov Emden's fundamental assumption. And he quotes the Ibn Ezra going back 900 years. The doctors only know what they see, but they don't know what's under your skin. Rabbi Yankov Emden, the Ibn Ezra was the greatest physician going back 900 years. And obviously he knew what he was talking about, but that was back then, when doctors really didn't have technology, they didn't have the means. So according to Ibn Ezra, the only things doctors could really treat is a skin rash, what they see, or a toothache. We're living in different times, my friends. And as you all know, well, doctors know a great deal of what's under our skin and what's in our internal organs. So this Maritzu is no longer relevant. But nevertheless, three of the greatest Gedolim in our generation. And many times, when we ask a fundamental question, is halacha live? Is it vibrant? Do we have chidushim in halacha? I think this psak is an unbelievable chidush, because it is not based on any early sources. But Reb Moshe, the Tshuvas I mentioned, Reb Shlomo Zalman, as quoted in Shulchan Shlomo and Yonah Refuah, and the Stipler. The Stipler was not really known as a Pesach. He was one of the greatest Lamdonim, one of the greatest Tzaddikim and Gedolim of our time. And today, we will malave his great son, the Beis Olam, Reb Chaim. So the Stipler was Reb Chaim's father. And the Stipler writes in a letter in Karyana di Igar Tekuf Tzadik, this saying: a terminally ill patient that is in pain has the right to forego treatment. Many times people ask me, should I sign a DNR? And I say no. That is a very bad idea. I think it is preferable to appoint a proxy, a Rav that you trust. And if worse comes to worse and you could no longer decide what type of treatment you want, pass that decision over to a trusted Rav and a qualified Rav. You should discuss with them your feelings, but leave it up to him, because signing a blank DNR, there are many situations in which one's life could be saved, and they will not do the effort to save his life. Many times a person could salvage his life and achieve quality of life as well. But signing a DNR won't give him that opportunity. So it is preferable to appoint a proxy. And if decisions need to be made, have your family, together with the Talmud Chacham, who is qualified, make those decisions. So as I said, a patient sometimes has the authority to say, I can no longer bear this treatment, and I leave it up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Does his family have that same authority? Just a few weeks ago, I participated in a Chemet conference in New York. We had an unbelievable weekend with 500 attendees, medical professionals, and I gave 4 shiurim, and one of the shiurim I gave was about the authority of close family members to decide when the patient could no longer decide for himself, or he doesn't feel he has the capacity to decide for himself. And I made it clear, yes, closest of kin, closest family members have the authority. So in my chuvas, I discussed it at great length. Is this authority based on the concept of Zechon V'Yodam Shalei V'Fonam Apetrapis? And I wrote, it is based on nature. It is based on nature. Kids care for their parents. Parents care for their kids. There is no one else to make these decisions. So the Moshe of Shlomo Zalman write, when you have an elderly parent, he is ill, he can no longer decide for yourself. It is up to you. But you need to bear in mind what is toivus hachayla, and detach yourself from your own interests and your own stress and your own difficulties. Your decision must be based on what is best for him. Reb Moshe says, you need to try to imagine what he would want. But that is irrelevant when parents need to decide for a child. You cannot try to guess what a child would want. A child is not supposed to want, and he is not supposed to be aware of options. So what you need to bear in mind is what is best, either for your elderly parent or for your child. It's not about you, it's about the patient. So I want to tell you a crazy story, which I was exposed to. And this just takes my present discussion to the extreme. Non-Jewish family, their father was terminally ill, terribly ill. He was dying. And the apotropos, the family, told the doctors, do everything you can to prolong his life. Resuscitation, intubation, do everything. And the doctors were shocked. And they said, you're a modern liberal family. Why do you want to do this to your elderly father? They were embarrassed to say, like they planned a vacation 6 months in advance. And they wanted to leave to the Bahamas, and they didn't want their dying father to shatter and disturb their vacation. So they asked the doctors, just keep him going, whatever it takes. Crazy story. But I just want to make stress and bring home the point. You have authority, but you cannot abuse that authority. And your authority is to decide what is the best for the patient. So my general psak is, and I have these shilas almost every day, intubate or not to intubate. And I say you intubate if there's a chance to extubate. So when a person no longer has functioning lungs, we could intubate, but there's no chance to extubate. And there's no mitzvah just pumping oxygen into his lungs, causing extreme pain and needing to sedate him just to prolong his death. Resuscitate or not to resuscitate. Resuscitation and intubation is important and is called for when there is a chance to bring him back. You're not going to make him young again. You might not be able to give him great quality of life, but you could get him over the hurdle. He has pneumonia. He could be treated with antibiotics. You intubate, we hope to extubate. His heart stopped beating by shock. Might be a car accident. There might be infection. He could be treated. But if a person has lung cancer and he no longer could breathe on his own, or congestive heart failure, and his heart no longer has the energy, the strength to keep on pumping, and it would be just futile. Resuscitate, break all his ribs, causing extreme stress and pain and needing to sedate him, that is not a mitzvah. So we are to intubate if there's a chance to extubate. We need to do resuscitation if there's a chance that his heart could keep on beating on its own. So not in every situation do we need to intervene. In Shin Lametes and Yoreh, there are two fundamental halachas. And they seem to contradict one another. One halacha is you need to preserve life and do everything you can to prolong life. And the other halacha is if a person is a kaiser, we do nothing to prolong the gesisa. Let him go. We don't have a clear halachic definition of what is a kaiser. Poskim don't discuss this question. We have the tools to define what is a chodesh yesh b'sakana, what is a chodesh she'ein b'sakana. There are no clear halachic definitions of what is a kaiser. But we do have halacha in Yoreh Shin and it says ein marichin. We do not prolong the season. So this is a very, very delicate balance. But sometimes, when it is obvious that a person is approaching the end of his life, and my friends, I've been there more than once. I've been there with my elderly parents. My father passed away at the age of 89, 6.5 years ago. I'm still in a shnas Evel. My mother passed away 3 months ago. It's almost 5 months by now. So I've been there. My wife passed away when she was 60. And she had lung cancer. And it was so obvious to me, just to ease her pain. And I asked the doctors to give her morphine. And it was aware maybe we're shortening her life. Maybe yes, maybe no, we would never know. But it was clear to me. And I know that was the Moshe's psak in cases I personally know about. When a patient is in extreme pain, you need to ease his pain and you need to make them more comfortable. So this is a very, very delicate line to walk. So, terminal sedation is murder. You never sedate a person to end his life. That is something we don't do. But we do try to ease one's pain. And I know that this is a very delicate balance. Never would we actively bring about a person's demise, no matter how sick he or she might be. We don't shorten intentionally one's life, never. And that is why we don't pull the plug. But we are not always mechuyev to prolong life. And sometimes we just sit back and tell HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shem Nosan, Hashem Yikach, and not only Hashem Lokach. Sometimes we just lift our eyes to the heavens and say, Rabbeinu Shalom, from this point on, it's up to you. Many times I'm asked by doctors in their profession, they are required to participate directly or indirectly in procedures that might not be halachically compatible. Nurses or an anesthesiologist who has to administer anesthesia for an abortion, terminating a pregnancy, which is not permissibly al pi halacha. So if you could try to get out of these situations, do your best. If you can't get out of this situation, then you're just administering anesthesia. That would not be defined as a mesayeh. Maybe indirectly, you're part of the process. You do not need to lose your license in a situation like that. So I discussed some of the dilemmas, some of the issues that come up in the broad spectrum of end of life issues. I wish you all siyata d'shmaya. We should always, Kadosh Baruch should be with us. Shalom ekosher b'dvar halacha. We are here to enhance life, prolong life, preserve life, because life is more precious than anything else. The Rambam at the end of Perek Aleph of Mila, at the end of the first Perek of Hilchos Mila, the Rambam writes, I don't see myself as there. The Rambam explains the halacha. When a child's life might be in jeopardy, we will postpone circumcision. We don't do Mila. And the Rambam writes, Pikuach nefesh doichi kol ha-mitzvahs. Efshar lo maliyach hazman. Aval nefesh odom yisol she'ovad hi efshar lahachziro. That's an amazing addition, and many achronim wonder, why does the Rambam write that? And I think that's just the Rambam's profound insight. Why is it that Pikuach Nefesh overrides any other mitzvah? Nothing is final in this world besides death. Any mitzvah, and when it's not this mitzvah, it will be other mitzvahs. But when a person's life is lost, no one can bring it back. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'tchiyas hamesim. So my bracha to all of you, the active doctors and the future doctors, we should all have the schus to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, preserve life, prolong life, enhance life. And we should share our efforts. L'aseh ritzon Hashem. Bring peace to the world. U'lekadosh Shem Shemayim. Thank you for being with me.
Rabbi Fogel, do you have any questions?
First, I obviously wanted to thank the Rav for that unbelievable, wonderful shiur, informative. A few of the questions that were posed, which the Rav dealt with at the end. In general, I want to know if the Rav could address more specifically the roles of frum physicians. For example, when a patient, the Rav spoke about DNR and appointing a family member, and instead of signing a DNR, what would a frum physician do? When you have or a trainee, a resident, how do you communicate that to the patients? If you met a patient who was ready to ask for physician-assisted suicide, which the Rav said is us, or what do you do? How do you deal with that situation? And again, sorry.
Physicians today are faced with challenges we didn't even imagine a few years ago. End-of-life issues is only a small part of this unbelievable challenge. And I am asked every day by physicians about gender change and transgenders. So in America especially, if a child comes to you and asks for hormone blockers, you're not even allowed to share this information with a parent. What is a frum doctor supposed to do if a frum boy comes to him and says, yes, he wants to change his gender and he asks for treatment? and you can't even share this information with parents. So what are you supposed to do? Act in accordance to halacha, or put your profession in jeopardy? So we are confronted today with challenges and shilas which we didn't dream will ever be relevant in the past. But I don't want to complicate matters, and I was asked to talk about end of life. So let's put transgender aside for another opportunity. Regarding end of life issues, I think you just need to give your patients options. Obviously, if he's a firm patient, you need to try to instruct him to the best of your knowledge what is right, and try to give him advice which is based on halacha. If you're dealing with a non-Jewish patient or a non-firm patient, and you're really afraid you might put your license in jeopardy, because that person might turn to the board and say, the doctor tried to convince me, and to coerce me, and in that case, you just give them the options. Try not to be directly involved. If you could refer them to someone else, do so. If it's a firm family, I think you do need to try to fulfill your halachic duties and try to convey to them they should speak to thereof, or share with them your understanding and your knowledge. I don't hear you.
Sorry about that. I know the Rav touched on the concept of geisis. Is there a difference in geisis for Yehudi and Eino Yehudi in this regard? Someone wanted to know.
I do not recall any source that differentiates between a Jew and a non-Jew regarding the dinam of geisis. I think it is obvious, geisis is either when a person no longer has breath and, breathing becomes very, very shallow. And usually that happens at the last stage of life, or multi-system failure. I don't know exactly how to define geisis, but I do not think there's a difference between Jew and non-Jew regarding the concept of geisis.
Maybe the Rav can expand a little bit, physicians or residents, when they want to present all the options, or just to be clinically sound in what they're presenting, they have to say these are all the possibilities. How do you do that at the same time? You're not going to lose your license. You're not going to tell them what to do, but you're presenting. How do you deal with that? As a physician or as an attending or resident.
As a physician, I think this is something, I share with you some of my personal experiences. One of the problems we have today is doctors today feel that they need to be totally open with patients and tell them exactly what their situation is. And sometimes it shatters their spirits and takes away hope. And I spoke to oncologists a lot about this. And I say sometimes all a person is left with is hope. And you take away his hope, it leaves him with nothing. And he becomes totally depressed. And that will it might even shorten his life. So I think in consultation with a family, it is not always the right thing to do. So in Shulchan Aruch, on one hand, Shulchan Aruch says, we need to tell a patient that he's dying. Maybe he wants to convey a message to his children. Maybe he wants to tell them some things that are important for him to tell them, either write at Savoa or convey certain messages. However, the Shulchan Aruch says, but if there is a chashash that you're going to shatter his spirits, you don't even say vidui. You should not say vidui with him. So this is more up to the family, together with a physician. When do we share all this information with a patient, or leave it up to the family? That is regarding one aspect, sharing with the patient this condition. Now, sharing with the patient or the family the options. Well, obviously, they know something about the options. They could treat or not treat. So I think you need to delicately encourage them to treat, but only in those situations in which that is the right decision. I mentioned the case of the 15-year-old girl. Sometimes it is not up to you at all as a physician. And sometimes it really is the patient's choice. But you need to give him the options. You need to explain to him clearly what could he expect with treatment, what would he expect without treatment. And if halachically, it is right to choose one course, you need to do your best to try to steer him down that path. I'm trying to make myself as clear as possible.
That's great. I see Rabbi Fold has his hand raised.
I just want to underline one thing the Rav said. When he said that rather than DNR, one should have a family member present, that's so clear and so absolute. The mitzvah of kibbud av applies. How could a family member not be the Rosh Hamita? But I want you to understand the ramifications of DNR are that the nursing staff and the technicians quite often realize this patient has been tossed to tel hayeyosh, if you will. And the quality of care and the amount of bed sores, the amount of yisurim exponentially increase. DNR is a very dangerous order to sign. What the Rav said is so absolutely ausgehalten in what it looks like in the corridors of hospitals. One should think many times before such an order is ever issued.
Rabbi Fold, thank you for the compliments, and thank you for signing off on my psak.
No. Just underlining it.
Thank you.
Do we have time for?
We understand each other, my dear friend.
Do we have time for a few more questions or follow-ups?
We have time for one more. I apologize, but
No problem. I guess this is is there? I get a little bit more technical, but someone wanted to know: is there a point where when you're dealing with feeding and hydrating a terminal patient who has stopped taking things by mouth, or a patient with advanced dementia or other debilitating illnesses, is there a minimum amount they need to take? How do we, do they take less? Feeding tubes? If I could address that type of question.
Yes, these are, I mentioned before that technology is a blessing on one hand, but it brings forth so many questions and dilemmas. Life was far more simple in days of yore, and so was death. You didn't have many choices. So in modern ethics, there is what we call heroic measures. Would halacha accept, this type of definition? I think so. It is impossible to define what do we mean when we use the term heroic measures, but I think administering nutrition, hydration, oxygen, those are the basics. People die without food, they die without fluids, they die if they can't breathe. Those are usually not heroic measures. But what families sometimes aren't aware of, the person at the end of their life no longer digests food. Sometimes the digestive system would no longer process food. So you need to have trusted doctors and professional doctors and nurses caring for the patient. Generally speaking, yes, you need to hydrate patients up to the end, because not hydrating them would mean hastening their demise, their death. I mean, dehydration causes death. You need to use the classical means of supplying nourishment, which is either a peg or a feeding tube. But sometimes in the very end of life, it no longer makes a difference. And the same with oxygen. Intubating is extreme stress for the lungs. People must understand what it means intubating a patient. It's pushing a tube down his lungs, blowing up a balloon to keep the air passage open, pumping air into his lungs. That is extreme pain. But just giving him oxygen is just easing his pain, and it's not going to go on forever. So I think you do need to give oxygen. You do need to give hydration. You do need to give, food in as much as is possible and is called for. These are the basic sustenance of life, which if you deprive a patient of them, it is hastening his demise, which is a total prohibition.
Thank you very much. If I could just say, I know there are a lot of questions that we don't have time for the Rav, but in the
I thank you all, and let me just say, I think these shiurim are extremely important. The cooperation of Rabbonim and doctors are so important to Jewish life. So thank you. I just want to finish. I cannot finish without a few words. Today, in Eretz Yisrael, we were Malava, one of the giants of our generation, the Weiss. It was a funeral like none before, and we hope none after. More than 500,000 people came together just for Kvoida Torah. Reb Chaim was a giant, a towering giant of Torah. And it's amazing why so many people felt attached to him, because he wasn't a speaker. He never spoke in public, never in his life. He wasn't a great Maggid Shiur. He never gave Shiur. He wasn't a great communicator. If anybody tells you he spent 10 minutes with Reb Chaim, he's probably a liar, or maybe he's hallucinating. He spent 15 seconds, a half a minute. He wasn't a communicator. At the end of his life, instead of saying Brocha v'Atzlacha, he had a genius abbreviation, Buha. You needed to figure out that means Brocha v'Atzlacha. So why do people love him? It's just amazing. I think because he was essentially all about Torah. That Reb Chaim, we knew years ago, was the greatest masmid of the generation, the greatest sage of the generation. And he was so pure and such an honor. As a member in my shul, grew up in Bnei Brak. He's about my age, and he remembers 50 years ago, the kids used to tease one another. Who's going to catch Reb Chaim? They used to wait for him when he finished davening, company on the way home, and they used to ask him, where's this written? Where's that written? They just opened the Gemara and just looked for a Mama Chazal. And they made believe that they don't remember a Gemara. And he patiently answered each and every one of them with an exact source, the exact daf. They never caught him with a Mama Chazal. He was the embodiment of a smoda, of a Ahavas Torah, of a nova. And it's a great loss. So he was 94 years old. And I mentioned before, nobody lives forever. So why do we mourn a 94-year-old person? Chazal say, Kosher silukim shel tzadikim kesreifas beis Elokeinu. When the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, did anybody ask, how old was this building? 420 years old. Well, buildings don't stand forever. Why are you crying? You know, this is quite an old building. Because the Beis Hamikdash is not just a building. The Beis Hamikdash is where HaKadosh Baruch Hu dwells. And we expected the Beis Hamikdash to be forever. We know that Gedolim are human. We know that they can't be forever. But from our point of view, we would expect them to be forever. And it's always hard to part. It was hard to part from a Beis Hamikdash. It's hard to part from Torah giants that we love and admire. He should be a Meretz Yosef for Klal Yisrael. We're going to learn his Torah for many, many years to come. He left an amazing Torah heritage. He should be a Meretz Yosef. We should only know the Torahs. So thank you all. We should all be Zeichel HaKadosh Shem Shemayim. Have a beautiful evening.